This clip tells the story of a winter flying trip that Ann and I took to A-Rene back in 1967. We had both learned to fly at the University of Illinois, and at that time were active in the Flying Illini. Along with our good friend and fellow pilot slash flight instructor Will Hubin, we were eager for all sorts of flying adventures. So we hatched a plan to drive north, get checked out on skis, and fly to A-Rene for a couple days just after Christmas 1967. This picture was taken in Sandstone, Minnesota, Will's parental home, just 155 miles south of Ely, Minnesota, where we would rent a plane. It was 18 degrees below zero when this picture was taken. It was a beautiful sunny day for our checkout at the fixed space operator Wilderness Wings. As you can see, there are all sorts of planes on skis there. Ours was to be the red and white Cessna 172 Tricycle Gear 92 Lima that the staff is readying for us. Here Ann is having a look inside. Notice there are bungee cord-like devices attached to the front of the skis. These make sure that the skis don't swivel downwards on landing. A really good idea. This is what she saw. A minimum instrument panel and no radio. Neither Ann nor I had ever flown without a radio, but I'm not sure about Will, who had many more hours than either of us. It did mean that all of our navigation would be by carefully following our maps, and we would have no means of communication when in the air or out on the island. Here is our plane, ready for us to begin our checkouts. The tricycle gear means there are 3 surfaces creating friction between the plane and the snow. It had never crossed my mind that friction might play a large part in flying off of snow, but it does. Our plane slid nicely on hard-packed snow, as you see in the picture. Checking all 3 of us out required most of the afternoon. This is what we saw once in the air. The snow down there is not packed. If you land in a place with no tracks, which we were sure to do, we were told that you might have to create a track with the plane before you could get up enough speed to take off again. Further complicating matters is the fact that the ice cracks underneath the snow, creating slush puddles. If any slush freezes to the skis, one may have to get out and push to get the plane moving, jumping in before it gets going too fast. What do you have to look out for when you land on a remote lake? As you will see in later pictures, it's easy to spot open water, which is a no-no. There are numerous spots where the ice buckles and forms pressure ridges, which you definitely don't want to hit on landing or cross when trying to take off. In a future picture, you will see a prime example of such a ridge. Much harder to spot from the air are pools of slush under the snow or weak ice. What you do is come in for a landing but bounce the plane before it stalls. You then circle around and look at the bounce mark. If water darkens the bounce mark, that's not a good place and you choose another. If the mark remains white, there should be solid ice underneath. You then do a landing approach and put the plane down right in the bounce mark. Having absorbed all these tips, we were ready to go the next morning after a night in a motel near Ely. Although the temperature had moderated just a bit up towards 0 Fahrenheit, that's still cold enough to require a preheat to start a plane. The second picture shows 92 Lima getting heat for us. That's a rather large machine with an ample fuel tank. It warms the oil and battery fairly quickly. The sun does not come up until well after 8 a.m., but when it did, we were ready. We had a long day ahead. We knew we had to go through customs, the first place in Canada that we would land. We decided to do that in Fort Frances. We would then fly northwest to Kenora, where we would purchase groceries. From there, out to Middle Island. It's fairly easy to match lakes on the map with the terrain you see from the air. However, we decided to follow the famous Echo Trail for the first part of the trip. This picture shows the little settlement of Crane Lake on the lake of the same name. At this point, the Echo Trail basically ended for us, and we kept on a northwest tack heading for Rainy Lake and Fort Frances. The picture shows our approach to landing at Fort Frances, which is located right on the border. The large cloud you see is from the mill, which operates from both countries. Also in the picture is an example of a pressure ridge, as I promised. You can see even from the air that you really don't want to mess with these on landing or takeoff for that matter. The frost on the windshield serves to remind that it is cold. Ann flew our first leg to the fort and made a perfect landing. We cleared customs with no problem. We did not realize at the time how much help those tracks you see that other planes had made were helping. Will was flying as we took off for Kenora. What you see is a present-day image from Google Earth, on which I have marked more or less our flight route. You can see the 2 legs of the trip. It totaled 160 air miles. We flew right over Crow Lake on our way. When we got out over Lake of the Woods, I was in home territory and started to recognize islands from the air. I had no trouble with Middle Island. It was the first time I'd ever seen it in winter, and in fact the first time from the air. The beavers have changed its features in the last 40 years, and there are more camps on the island now, but its shape remains the same. We're closer to Kenora now. You can see a good portion of Middle on the right, but also the smoke from the mill in Kenora. The two are separated by less than 8.5 air miles, but it would be a long, cold walk over the ice if we were marooned on the island. We were headed for the winter landing base in Cameron Bay. We didn't spend a lot of time in Kenora, just enough to get groceries for our 2 days at the cabin. I did manage to take this shot of the Fish Market Dock, our summer docking spot. You can also see the Matheson Street dock with attached floating docks, all covered with snow. Just beyond that is the Main Street dock with the cruise boat, the Argyle, frozen into its winter berth. It was my turn to fly the 8.5 miles to Middle Island. I knew from listening to Berger Anderson talk that he didn't drive his horses through our bay because it tended to be slushy. To avoid that problem, I thought it best to land down near Christina's Point of View, keep the plane there, and hike 300 or so yards to the cabin. So I brought her down and bounced on the ice as taught. After the requisite fly-around, during which we saw no slush marks, I put her down, of course exactly in the bounce mark, and taxied forward a bit. I want you to notice the telltale marks just behind the skis. Slush. We walked ahead. Slush. We walked back a bit. Slush. I had chosen about the only good spot to touch down. We would deal with it in the morning. It was important now to get heat going in the cabin. The 14-inch snow cover helped create a quiet like we had never heard before. Here's the main cabin in which we stayed. That fireplace was one of 3 heat sources we used. The cabin's not insulated and the floor is 2 feet or more off the ground. We banked on being able to keep warm enough to be at least semi-comfortable. As in the summer, the toilet was our outhouse. We managed. Our guest house at that time was 16 by 16 with no kitchen facilities. It did have a small airtight stove that heated quite well, but we did not consider it an option. We went out into the bay and chopped a hole in 18 inches of ice for water which we didn't have to melt, and for a little bit of fishing. No luck. This picture shows how we stayed warm. You can see the fire in the fireplace, but not the one in our kitchen cook stove. The little airtight stove is from the guest house. We vented it up through the fireplace chimney. The stove is a bit temperamental, and you see we have its lid slightly open so that it draws better. The front porch is closed off by some thin curtains because we didn't want to heat it also. Ann and I slept in the living room couch, and I got up every 2 hours to feed the fires. Will was in the loft where most of the heat went and was very comfortable. We closed off the 2 bedrooms with curtains and put our meat in there. It froze. The temperature outside was a bit below 0. At the table level in the cabin it was 65 degrees, although it was a bit colder on the floor. We were really quite comfortable. We were required to pay for 3 hours of flying time for each of the 3 days of our trip. Coming and going from Ely wasn't 3 hours, so the middle day we had a lot of hours we could fly, and of course we wanted to. The picture shows getting the plane ready. I am putting the warm battery back in and getting them ready to fill the oil sump with warm oil. Will is removing the covers we had put on the wings to prevent frost buildup. We saw that a little bit of slush had gotten frozen onto the skis, but the plane was not frozen stuck. We just turned it by hand and in the direction of Scotty Island, which would give us a good long takeoff run, even though there was a pressure ridge a ways down our path. This was our first takeoff out of 14 inches of snow without tracks laid down by other planes. There was a lot more friction, probably exacerbated by the bits of frozen slush on the skis, and a Cessna 142 with a tricycle gear is probably underpowered for deep snow. We found that at least one of us, usually 2, had to get out in the prop blast and push on the struts just to get moving. We expected to have to make a couple of runs to make a track. Actually, it took 13 runs. The aforementioned pressure ridge, which we did not think would enter in, actually kept us from making a longer track. Finally, Will, who was flying, saw the airspeed indicator flicker a bit and eased the plane into the air, clearing the pressure ridge. The bottom picture shows many of the loops we made to get a track. Once in the air, we flew around trying to take pictures of our neighbors' camps. This is South Middle Island, showing A. Renee and the Brismans' camp. Frost on the windows ruined some pictures. Here you can see Jep's place on Scotty. This shows the Hills camp on what has become to be called Hill Island. There were snow squalls around, one of which you can see at the top of the picture. We flew over the western peninsula and some open water on the Winnipeg River. After flying around for quite a while, we decided we should try a landing on one of the inland lakes. Before proceeding, I should remind you that 1. I was 27 years old, well past the age when the judgment gene kicks in, although in some cases it's a little slow. 2. Anne was in love. 3. I had previously been flying upside down with Will in an aerobatic plane. He was used to doing strange things in airplanes. I'd fished on Gale Lake down the Anila Peninsula and thought that would be a good place for our purposes. We all ignored the fact that 1. This lake is 15 miles farther down and 25 miles from Kenora. 2. The temperature was starting to drop and the wind was picking up. 3. We had no communications radio. 4. Our rations consisted of 1 large chocolate bar. And 5. We had trouble getting off with no track situation. Well, the facts had little influence on our subsequent judgment. We came in for a landing on Gale Lake. Will bounced, came around, saw no water, and put her down. The lake is long, so we could take off without turning. We walked ahead and found, you guessed it, slush. We decided Will would make a track, and since it would take both Anne and I pushing on the struts to get the plane moving, we would stay put while he made the track. As Will came back and made the turn, the left wing dipped within 6 inches of the snow, and I thought, uh-oh, but it came back up, and he stopped, saying that he thought we could get off, and after a push on the struts and a hop in, we did. Enough flying for today. Back to the cabin, stir up the fires, secure the plane, and retrieve the frozen pot roast from the bedroom, and prepared an excellent evening meal. The next morning was the day we were due back in Ely. The temperature, which was around 13 below at midnight, kept falling with a steady northwest wind. By the time we closed up the cabin and got the oil and battery back in, it was close to 23 below. When we poured the oil in, it congealed immediately and the engine would not turn over. Hand prompting didn't do the trick either. We needed heat. We retrieved the airtight stove from the guest house and draped the tarp over the engine. Anne sat underneath the tarp along with a fire extinguisher and fed the fire. Will and I stamped around on the ice trying to keep reasonably comfortable in the cold. The temperature headed down all day. The wind chill was in the -40s. The only food left was that emergency chocolate bar. We figured this was an emergency. Finally, about 3 p.m., after at least one unsuccessful try, we got her started. There was not enough daylight left to make it back to Ely, so we flew to Kenora, where we could buy heat in the morning, called Wilderness Wings, and took a cheap hotel room at the Kenwood Hotel. Hungry as we were, the food was so bad we could hardly eat it, but we were warm for the night. The next morning it was -37 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind had gone down. We bought heat and took off for Ely. The men at Wilderness Wings never thought we would make it, and had been drawing straws as to who would have to come and rescue us. I guess they didn't trust us with any kind of portable heater. Here Will says goodbye to 92 Lima. He had done most of the flying as a good deal of it required his greater skills, but I doubt that any 2 of us alone could have pulled it off. When we reminisce over the years about that trip, the words that come up over and over again are, we were crazy. Crazy for sure, but one of the very good memories to add to 60 years at the lake.